It is a great honor to welcome Andrew Gleeson on this program. He is a retired Australian philosopher, and he makes occasional videos about philosophy and religion on the YouTube channel, The Speaking Lions. How are you today, Andrew? Thank you for joining us.
I'm good, thank you, Sean. Okay,
Right.
hope you are too.
Yeah, the pleasure is all mine. So I should like to begin by asking you about your background, your life and career as a philosopher and public thinker.
Well, I have had did my original undergraduate philosophy degree at the University of Adelaide in Australia back in the 1980s. Then I left academia for quite a while, did other things, including a period as a journalist. Then I returned to academia, did a PhD in philosophy, originally in philosophy of mind, but then moved into moral philosophy, philosophy of religion, other areas. I've taught in or been at universities in South Africa for a while, and then in back in Australia at a few different universities. And I retired in 2018. In terms of my role, such as it is as a public intellectual, I'm not sure whether I should call myself something like that, but I think I've sort of found a new vocation for myself in my retirement in mixing my two careers of journalist and philosopher by writing sort of philosophically informed, philosophically influenced articles in various of the new kind of online platforms that have emerged in the era of social media, and I enjoy doing that. And we're here to talk about one of them. So,
oh yes,
which you've read, of course, yeah.
Yeah. So I was introduced to you and your work via an article that you published on Quillette, a site that I visit frequently. It is titled "The First Stone," and it is a comparison, if I can call it, between what happened to the UK broadcast host, I guess, journalist Philip Schofield, and the great playwright, author, writer Oscar Wilde.
Yep.
Nevertheless, I would like to mention a previous article you contributed to the site, and that is a tribute to the great Aussie comedian Barry Humphrey. So
Yes.
until his passing and the article, I've never heard of him. So why don't you tell us about him and his significance?
Well, I was going to say I was just surprised that you live in Austria, in Vienna, is that correct?
Yes.
Yeah, I was going to be surprised if people in Vienna were very aware of Barry Humphries. But yeah, he is an Australian comedian who died this year quite suddenly, unexpectedly, although he was well into his 80s, I think his late 80s, something like that. But he started his career, was born in Melbourne, grew up in a fairly conventional suburban middle-class home in Melbourne, and was educated at Melbourne University. And in his undergraduate days, we used to tread the boards in amateur theatre, undergraduate theatre, and he hit upon a character of a sort of how would you describe her? She was a housewife, on one hand an ordinary housewife, but one who was extracted from her ordinariness to achieve sudden fame on an international scale. And she's a rather eccentric character, very over the top. She dress in these very elaborate drag sequined gowns and huge bejeweled glasses and multicolored hair and all sorts of things. And she was kind of he managed, I think, in the character of Edna to satirize both two kinds of, well, two kinds of things, or two kinds of persons, perhaps, both um, the somewhat conservative suburban traditional Australian background from which he came, which marked a certain insularity or closed-mindedness in Edna, and a certain Australianness in her, while at the same time satirizing what was, I guess, in the 50s and 60s, still very much emerging as the sort of international kind of cult of celebrity, which bears, of course, on Wilde and Schofield. And he managed to satirize both of these very cuttingly. And the character took off and became incredibly successful. He took it to the UK in the early 60s, and it really took off and became a tremendous success there, where eccentric Australians were all the rage. And he continued Dame Edna as his most famous act right up until his death. He was primarily a stage performer, but he also did some films and some television, some books. He created another couple of characters that I talk about in that piece. There's a equally eccentric Sir Les Patterson, who was the incarnation of everything scabrous and vulgar about Australians. And then, as a counterpoint to both Edna and Les, he created another character who's, and when you get to my age, this is your memory sometimes fails you just when you want. His name just escapes me for the moment, but who was a much more sympathetic kind of character. Wasn't the loud, aggressive kind of characters that both Edna and Les was, but was a much less assuming, rather humble, gentle kind of soul. And there the humor became more a kind of humor of pathos. And I think that was quite a important counterpoint. I suspect that character, as I say, his name just escapes me for the moment, but that character was perhaps his finest creation. So yes, I mean, I don't know. I hadn't thought of connecting the two pieces, but there are connections there for sure.
Mhm.
Absolutely.
Yes, and I was surprised to learn that he was the voice behind Bruce the Shark in the Finding Nemo movie.
Well, that was news to me too. I've
Yeah.
not seen the movie, so
Yes.
I do believe he did appear in a couple of shows. If anyone's seen the Rocky Horror Picture Show movie,
Oh,
he
yes.
appears as Frankfurter, I think. I think
Oh.
he's in that as well. I think so. I think I'm right in saying that. And also, if you remember the Hitler Diaries, this famous case in the 80s of a forged, this German gentleman forged a set of diaries and attributed them to Hitler. There was a British TV series about it, and he played Rupert Murdoch, played another Australian. Because Rupert Murdoch, his newspapers published the diaries, they were fooled by them, and it was a great embarrassment for Murdoch.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
Let's see.
yeah.
This might be a very touchy topic to bring about, but around the same time of Barry Humphries' death, another, I guess, uh, towering, so to speak, Australian comedian slash entertainer passed away too, right? Rolf Harris, and I think when you mentioned
Oh
the name
yeah,
of Rolf Harris, that sort of brings up awful memories to Australians.
yeah, no, absolutely. Again, Rolf Harris was another Australian who had great success in the United Kingdom, but again, is really not known at all outside Australia and the UK. He was a very different kind of character. He was a singer, a painter, a light comedian. He didn't do the kind of satirical comedy that Dame Edna did. His comedy was much more gentle and I would say much more, how we say, is suitable for the children and kind of domesticated than Edna and Les were somewhat risque often. but of course he blotted his copybook rather seriously, as we know. And again, you're right. It's the same kind of theme is lurking there. He is someone who was a tremendous success, and this never happened to Humphreys. So Humphreys is perhaps the odd one out in this group that we're talking about. Humphreys never had a fall from grace of this sort, but the fall from grace of Rolf Harris was much more serious than that of Philip Schofield. I mean, he's up there in the kind of Epstein and Harvey Weinstein and these characters, or in Britain, the case of Britain, probably the worst of them all, the horrendous Jimmy Savile. I mean, I think in a way we're kind of those kind of cases, sexual abuse cases and so forth. We're kind of perhaps dealing with something where there's an added factor there compared to Schofield or Oscar Wilde, but who are the subjects of this more recent piece of mine. But yeah, Harris definitely fits into that a tremendously successful person. Never wasn't somebody to show great signs of arrogance. He always had something of a reputation of him as being a man of the people. But then so I suppose in a way did Jimmy Savile. Although Savile, I don't know if you ever have seen Savile and video clips or whatever, but he made your blood crawl. Seriously, he was hiding in plain sight, that guy. But Harris is another case, somebody who fell from grace in a serious way, and I don't think he looked like at the end like he was a man, struggling to find some kind of redemption. I hope he did, but I don't know. But yeah, I guess that's one of our themes today: is the possibilities of redemption, or how people like this are treated. To my knowledge, I don't think Harris was subjected to the kind of venom that was directed at Oscar Wilde, and that has been directed at Philip Schofield. Not as far as I know. I mean, I don't live in the UK. I live in Australia, but I do get access through my smart TV to a lot of UK media, and a lot of stuff is put out as YouTube clips and so forth. So my knowledge is largely through that source. But my impression is that he wasn't quite the object of scorn and derision that Wilde and Schofield Wilde was, and that Schofield has become.
I think the difference between Savile and Harris is, as far as I can tell, I guess the allegations regarding Savile only surfaced in a tidal wave really after his death, whereas
yes.
Harris saw his fame disappear before him as he lived.
Yeah. No, that's right. And one of the things that it's good that you've raised these cases, because one of the points I made, the first stone. Perhaps we should maybe I should just say a little bit about what the first stone was about, just so viewers can know why we're talking about Rolf Harris and how the first stone, which is a reference to the gospel passage where Jesus tells the crowd about to stone the woman caught in adultery, and says to them, let you who is without sin cast the first stone. Oscar Wilde, the great English genius playwright, was long story short, through his own foolishness in rashness in action in various ways, he ended up being prosecuted under the rather cruel laws of the time against sodomy, and ended up doing 2 years hard labor for gross indecency. And obviously the very act of incarceration itself was already a massive blow to anyone's standing. But interestingly, he says it himself in De Profundis, this great work of self-reflection that he wrote when he was in prison. He says of the other inmates who were generally from the poor, from the working class and the poor. And he said that, well, for the poor, for the working class, jail is a hazard, just a hazard of life. And so long as the man's crimes are not against women or children, they're generally accepted back into their community, quite happily. But when the man of our class, he says, through talking to his ex-lover, Bosie Douglas, to whom the book was written as a letter, he says, to men of our class, we become a pariah. A gentleman who's been to jail is forever marked out, forever discarded, punished, just exiled from society. And that's what happened to. He went from being the toast of the Paris and London to London and Paris to being treated in utter scorn, and disdain. And after leaving jail, he left the country, went to France, and basically hid there for the rest of his life and died in penury. Now, Philip Schofield, of course, if people don't know, and I'd never heard of him. Well, no, I had heard of him, but I knew very little about him before this. But he is a current, or was until very recently, a current British television personality on a very successful program on the ITV channel called This Morning, a kind of light entertainment interview, newsy program that used to air, I believe, in the late morning. And he's been on it for quite a few years. And he recently had a very dramatic fall from grace, in which he was found that he'd been lying to his employers, lying to his colleagues, lying to his wife, lying to his family, lying to his agents, and so forth, to conceal the fact that he'd had a gay sexual relationship with a much younger man, who was his subordinate in the company, whom he'd helped to get a job in the company, who was much below him and you're much inferior in his power and status and so forth. And of course, that kind of relationship, I mean, not that it was gay, but the fact that it was a relationship between a much more powerful and senior person and a much more junior one, the fact that he'd got him a job and so forth, that's been a massive scandal. And he's been subject to a quite extraordinarily venomous and nasty vilification in the media, from largely his not just anonymous trolls on Twitter, which is a par for the course, I think, in this day and age, but from his peers, from his contemporaries, from his former colleagues. And he may well have done, what a lot of that said about him factually may be true. He may have been a very unpleasant and vain and behaved in very arrogant ways towards colleagues and getting other people, but the degree of revenge being wreaked on him, it's started to subside now, I think, but it went on for weeks, just on a daily basis, was I thought quite strikingly cruel. Now, we got onto this from Rolf Harris. So there's the connection to Rolf Harris. He's another example, again, somebody who was, as it were, a tremendous success, someone who was feted, someone who was famous, someone who was rich, someone who was powerful, who has lost everything, been brought low, humbled, humiliated. And I was struck in thinking about Schofield, observing the Schofield case, just how his situation resembled the case of Wilde, and I was aware of Wilde's reflections on this in De Profundis, and they seem to me to have a general moral for anyone who's in that kind of position. So sorry, I may have gone on a little bit long there. Sorry.
No, it's okay. I think you made the connection between the subjects, so to speak, for me. Humphreys, Harris to Schofield to Wilde and more. But you mentioned that your interest in the topic, which is so celebrity stuff, which this podcast doesn't cover too usually either, is because of the news coverage that surrounded him, Schofield, specifically what you see in GB News in Britain and Sky in Australia. So what struck you about their tone of coverage?
Well, it maybe I could go back a little bit earlier than Schofield, just bringing yet another case. We've got several cases. but the one which is gone on the longest, and in some ways was the most shocking. And I was originally going to talk about this case in the piece as well, but in the end, it didn't have room to include it. But that's the case of Harry and Meghan, the Duke and Duchess of Sussex. Now, again, I'm no fan of Harry and Meghan, and I think that they, well, it's not for me to add to that, especially given what I've said, not for me to add to calumnies against them. But I think a lot of they could be deserving of some severe criticism in a number of ways. So I'm not necessarily at odds with the general thrust of a lot of the criticism of them. But again, it's extra. I mean, over the top is almost too weak a phrase. I mean, it's an extraordinary level of viciousness, nastiness. I mean, just preparing for this interview today, I just at random went to a recent on YouTube video clip from well, indeed it was from GB News. Here's just some of the language that came up in this randomly chosen clip. Money-minded Montecito runaways, one-trick family bashing ponies, perma-victim pair, finally getting a taste of their own medicine, which is poison. Everyone hates you. Well, that's what you say. Everyone hates you. Meghan is a vicious liar and a very manipulative, nasty human being who has no compunction about destroying her father and disabled sister. Okay, and I could go on. The thing to understand is that there are literally thousands of these, but they come out daily. There's a massive industry around Meghan and Harry bashing. Okay, now and of course there's truth. If people say they brought it on themselves, well, there's truth in that. But again, is there to be no room at all? I mean, does that license the extremity of the luridness of this language? Is the fact they brought it on themselves to close up all possibility of forgiveness? I don't know. It seems nasty to me. And that's what got me thinking about it, and thinking about Wilde's reflections on fame, on falling from fame, humiliation and suffering, and the possibility of redemption.
Yes, and
yeah, go on. Sorry.
right. I was thinking about the case of obviously this pretty well-known British television journalist broadcaster Piers Morgan. I'm sure everyone knows him.
Yeah.
I think when he was still starting out, he was basically a star in the British tabloid press industry, and he was tapped by actually Murdoch to run, I think, the Daily Mirror or News of the World, whatever. And he made a name for himself bashing celebrities, people whose names are more well known than him. But as he became more famous, ironically, he started to see that he started to have a taste of his own medicine, so to speak, and that people were particularly vicious at him at one point. I think when he retired from CNN because he couldn't compete with Larry King. Surprise there. But what I see recently about Piers Morgan, although I still see some of his nasty traits there, he's become like a less unpleasant human being. And yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean I certainly know of Piers Morgan, and he's been one of the most persistent and consistent Harry and Meghan bashers. Oh, yeah. There seems to be something personal in that as well, as I think there's a bit of personal story there between him and Meghan. But he of course is not fallen from grace, not yet anyway. I think he's pretty thick-skinned too. I mean, for all those who do suffer humiliation, there are, There are those who never do, who perhaps are never humbled. And one of the issues I raise in the piece, I go so far as to suggest that I think I say, I forget my exact words, but something like it may be hard for Schofield to see this now, but perhaps he's almost the lucky one in the situation.
Right.
That may sound unsympathetic. It's not meant to be. It's the thought that he has the opportunity to achieve something that's in his life, which is of far more value than money or fame or success, and that is humility.
Mhm.
And to realize that his life had gone off the rails, that perhaps he'd become a not the nicest kind of person, if you like, let's just put it like that, and that he has a real opportunity to reform and redeem himself, and that those who as it were can maintain all the protections from hurt and pain that fame and wealth afford, that protect you, that kind of put you in a kind of protective shell which prevents the illusions of your own invulnerability from being stripped away. Okay. Those people, those who never have those illusions stripped away, will continue to live in those illusions, and those illusions are, you may be okay physically, but they're damaging to you at a spiritual level, and that's very much what Oscar Wilde is talking about in De Profundis.
So you mentioned a quote from Professor Kathleen Stock, formerly of
Yes.
University of Sussex, who I've had the pleasure of talking to her. She's a pretty wonderful guest, and she mentioned that Schofield and his co-host, was it Holly Willoughby of that British morning show? She remarked that they possess this. Their program is pathologically bland, pathologically nice. Everything dark is just pushed away, and it's a sunshine studio. And I think there's a connection there between these two and Harry and Meghan of the royal family, in that they project a certain image of, I guess, a particular cleanliness that people who are, I guess, people who live in daily lives like you and I don't find that to be authentic. We find it to be superficial, and perhaps that's why we, and also motivated by this wing of the press that you're talking about, heap scorn upon them.
Yes, well, it's I was really struck by what Kathleen Stock said. When you watch those kinds of programs, there is a complete absence of, you almost find yourself crying out for, I just see a moment of genuine anger or sorrow, okay, or joy, instead of a constant and continued pretense of uniform super happiness. But at least when you watch the news, okay, I mean, you see certainly in when the news reports on tragic events, and to some extent in debates and discussions on public affairs, I think you see real emotion showing. But there's a kind of spell or illusion that's being maintained in the kind of celebrity world, as I like to call it, of where everything is about image, everything is about presentation, everything is about facade, and reality is hidden. And as Kathleen observes, when suddenly the bubble is suddenly burst, okay, and the machinery behind the stage is exposed, as I suggest in the piece, that perhaps, was one of the reasons why he was so bitterly attacked, was because he had exposed not just himself, but perhaps an entire genre of television and celebrity coverage and that sort of thing. had exposed its almost its fakeness. And just on that point, I mean, this is highly speculative, so I don't want to be read. Viewers or listeners should not take this as something I'm asserting with any great confidence. But thinking about since writing the piece, I've wondered whether there is something in it of a scapegoat phenomenon. You might be familiar with the work of the Rene Girard on the scapegoat. His theory of the scapegoat was that violence, social cohesion, or violence is controlled and social cohesion maintained in societies. But when the violence is escalating and it's reaching a crescendo, one way in which it avoids tearing the society completely apart is that it's both sides unite in directing their anger and hatred onto a particular individual who might be to one side of the main matters in dispute, and who becomes the object of a kind of shared contempt. And I just wonder whether it's something like that. It's happening with Harry and Meghan. I mean, it's not. I don't know that it fits perfectly the theory, because most of the scorn and so forth is coming from one. It's coming notably from anti-woke, professedly anti-woke, kind of conservative, and not all anti-woke are conservative, of course, but conservative and anti-woke kind of media who don't like Harry and Meghan, who are woke or perceived as woke, and I don't like woke this much myself, but nevertheless, there isn't a similar kind of attack on them coming from the woke side, I don't think. But nevertheless, it seems like there's maybe something like that is still going on. At least one side. It just seems. I just wonder whether it's only a coincidence that this kind of nastiness towards public figures who fall from grace in this way is happening at the same time as our public political life is as toxic, to use the too often repeated word, is as toxic as it is. And whether this is in part a sort of automatic kind of genuflection or attempt by at least one side in that war to kind of let off some of the steam towards somebody who's, those who are not really so involved. I mean, Harry and Meghan are kind of involved, but not that much. I don't know much about it, but I don't think Schofield's much involved in political matters in any way, to my knowledge. So that's a very speculative thought, but could be. I don't know.
Well, I think you mentioned the phrase anti-woke, and I should like to mention that I myself am too. I mean, it's basically a dogma that is filled with nonsense, so to speak. But I do notice that there is an increasing dogmatism in those who call themselves anti-woke, and I think most notably, there's a huge correlation between those who say that they are anti-woke and those who say that that who express profound skepticism towards, say, the COVID vaccine, or hating on like particular celebrities like Harry and Meghan. And I find that to be the connection to me doesn't really make sense. Like, just because you don't like this particular ideology does not mean that you have the license to doubt medical science.
Yeah. Yes, well, and of course, I mean, like any political position, there's enormous variation from person to person and one factional group to another. Certainly, when you look at, I mean, you've probably never seen Sky News Australia, but I think it's particularly bad. And I just think that it's not that they never say anything true, or that, but they pander to an audience who wants to hear a certain group of people to get bashed, and they repeat cheap talking points and shallow polemical arguments without having any really serious discussion about anything. GB News is not quite as bad as that, and they have some good program. I think Andrew Doyle, for example, is very good. It's Free Speech Nation, if you know that segment. But they also tend to be similar, unfortunately. I mean, it's partly commercial, okay? They're struggling for their share of the market, although GB News has proved very successful. So there, it's multi-causal, but you're right. I mean, there's always the risk that any political position will harden into dogmatism if you don't maintain your independence. That can certainly help. Your alertness, your self-criticism, your willingness to examine things, and that's it's very easy to become lazy, to become too comfortable, or to become rah for my team, to become a mere partisan and not a thinker. So I mean, one of the things that's really good about Quillette is that I think that they try to, and in general, succeed in publishing writers who, on the whole, are trying to think seriously for themselves about issues, and that doesn't preclude being polemical to some extent on when it's appropriate and so forth, but it's backed up by something thoughtfulness, and certainly in everything I write, such as this, it's not that much, it's not that big a body of work, but I always try and find something more thoughtful, whatever the contemporary event that might be the occasion for a piece. I always try and say something which is a bit more thoughtful, a bit more depth to it, and not just polemicize or score points or something. Yeah.
Yes. I think I should also like to mention that currently the anti-woke faction's greatest, like most favorite celebrity author now is obviously J.K. Rowling because of her stance against transgender issues. But if you go back like 4 or 5 years before she made these remarks, she is probably the most woke person on earth because there's this notable incident where she tried to retcon the important Harry Potter character, Professor Albus Dumbledore, as a gay man, and that's why in the current, like, what is it, Fantastic Beasts series, Dumbledore is now portrayed as a gay man, and she was like widely pilloried for it. But that also got me thinking that in these cases that you've mentioned, including Wilde and perhaps excluding Humphreys, these big name people may have done something that they know and we know to be wrong, and they've brought, they deserve some, if not all, of the scorn that's been directed at them. So, what do you think about that particular position?
Well, that's certainly a kind of objection which people are going to make. And it's certainly true in most of those cases. I mean, even in Oscar's case, though he was certainly subject to what I would certainly regard as a cruel and unjust law, he nevertheless was foolish in various ways. He was rash because it all arose from the fact that he took an action for libel against his lover's father, the Marquess of Queensberry. That was a rather rash action, which he took against the advice of friends. But also, we shouldn't forget that he did consort with rent boys. I'm not quite sure what their ages were, but some of them were probably pretty young. And I'm taking it that these were young men, boys who, were basically very, very poor, and the only way they had enough to eat was either by thieving or by selling themselves. So I think that's probably could be regarded as a bit morally on the dark side. And his lavish lifestyle in general, okay, was something which I think he was deeply remorseful for, and so it's true. But and there's part of me which sympathizes with that objection, which thinks, like, if you don't want to be ridiculed, then don't make yourself ridiculous, but I mean, what a person deserves, it seems to me, when they go wrong in that way, is they certainly are deserving of censure and correction. Absolutely. But what they get here is more than censure, more than correction, more than being told, hey, look, look at yourself, look at the way you're behaving, and you've got to face some consequences for it. But it's an entirely other thing to be subject to put in the pillory, as Wilde says, subject to, I quote in the piece from him being on the railway platform when he was being transferred from one prison to another, and being this object of scorn from the public, who ridicule and contempt. People would come up and just laugh at him, and that in response to this, he wept at the same time every day for the same period of time for a year. That seems to me to be, that's not holding somebody accountable. That's just denigrating them. That's just belittling them, demeaning them. That's not how you bring out the best in a person. Okay, that's not how you'll lead a person to reform themselves and become a better and turn over a new leaf. And perhaps more tellingly, as I said, it's hypocritical, because as I said before, so much of this industry, and no doubt, so much of the of the people in Wilde's world who turned on him, who would no longer have anything to do with him, and so forth, were just as living just as thoughtlessly as he was. So can they really cast the first stone in this way? Just while we're bringing together instances of this, another one has just occurred to me, which is this is something that British and Australian, I don't know who your audience predominantly is, but this will be best known to Brits and perhaps Australians, and but probably not to Americans or Europeans. But there was a very, very famous political scandal in the United Kingdom in the early 1960s, late 50s, early 60s, which in the end, I think, brought down the Conservative government of Harold Macmillan. And this concerned the Minister for Defence, or the Secretary for Defence.
Is it Profumo, right? The Profumo scandal, right?
The Profumo scandal. Profumo was having an affair with a young woman. Now my memory is going to fail me again. I'm sorry about this, Chong. Oh, God. No, it's just escaping me. Christine Keeler. Okay. A young woman who lived in a shadowy world where she entertained wealthy men at aristocratic house parties and so forth and so on. They were having an affair because it was the Secretary of Defence, MI5, the British domestic intelligence service, were listening in. They wouldn't have worried too much about the affair if it hadn't been for the fact that Keeler was also having a relationship with one Valery Ivanov, who was something like first secretary of the Soviet embassy. So you get the classic Cold War situation. Profumo lied to Macmillan, denied that he was having this relationship after MI5 had gone to the Prime Minister and said, "Oh, look, you got this tricky situation with your defence minister." And they called Profumo in. Profumo denied everything. Profumo denied everything, and then the Prime Minister Macmillan then told the Parliament that he had, the minister had denied, and he had confidence in anything. Of course, it all came out in the press eventually, and they both ended up having to resign. I think I'm not sure whether Macmillan had to resign or resign just over that. I could be wrong on that point, but certainly Profumo did. And there was a television series about the Profumo affair, which aired in Australia last year. So probably in the UK, maybe in 2021 or something like that, which was a 6-part series, something was called The Trials of Christine Keeler, because they're actually a series. It's a more complicated story than I've told. It was far too complicated to go through now, but there was a series of trials for different things. And the fall from grace was concentrated on was concentrated less on Profumo, who had all his aristocratic wealth to fall back on. But it was more something of a fall from grace to Christine Keeler herself, who ended up doing a period in jail for, I forget exactly what for, but she did. I think it may have been perjury. And a guy called a doctor. Not he wasn't a doctor. He was wasn't a physio. He was an osteopath or something like that. He was a kind of celebrity medical professional, quasi-medical professional who knew a lot of wealthy men, and also knew people from both ends of society, and introduced attractive young women seeking careers as models and whatever in London to aristocratic and wealthy men, including politicians and others. And he brought them together, and he was prosecuted for living off immoral earnings, essentially for being a pimp. And he committed suicide before verdict was brought down in his trial. He was really perhaps the main fall from grace in that story. And that also was a real study again in hypocrisy of the British establishment, which was incredibly cruel towards him and towards this doctor who again, his name escapes me, I'm afraid. I don't know if he was properly called a doctor, but anyway, he was a medical, some kind of medical or ancillary to medicine profession. So that's another one we can add to the list. Mm-hmm. Perhaps it doesn't throw any particular additional light on the general themes, but it's another example. Yeah.
Right. So I do read much about the Profumo affair and what happened to John Profumo. I think it was mentioned in one episode of The Crown, so that piqued my curiosity a bit.
Oh yes, indeed.
And
yeah.
if I remember correctly, shortly after Profumo lost his position in the Macmillan government, he worked for a charity, Toynbee Hall, if I got it correctly, and
I believe he worked for charity. Yes.
And as a result of his like really conscientious work, his name and reputation was rehabilitated, and then he was invited by Thatcher and the Queen to join them at their functions, right?
Okay, I didn't know that. I mean, I know he worked for charities, and I didn't realize that he'd been hobnobbed with the Queen and Mrs. Thatcher. But yes, I mean, there'll be questions there as whether that's a case of a serious reformation in his own life, or whether it's a case of the upper class look after their own in the longer run after. I'm not sure, but yeah. Okay, that's interesting.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case, and I wish to bring that up because you said in the Quillette article that right now Philip Schofield has a chance to restore his name, so to speak, and that may not involve him being involved in this industry of blandness that Kathleen Stock calls UK morning television. But what do you suppose the road to rehabilitation consists of?
Well, that's okay. Well, a relentless honesty with yourself. That's probably the first and foremost thing. An ability to see us. I mean, I talk in the piece about an opportunity. The opportunity is that Schofield has had all his illusions dispelled, all of the what the philosopher Iris Murdoch calls consoling fantasies, which are all the ideas and images we have about ourselves and the world, which we use to protect our ego and to hide us from the fact that we're weak and vulnerable and mortal, and we're wrongdoers, and we're often selfish and cruel and thoughtless in so many ways. He's had all that at least temporarily shattered. Now, there's always, I mean, as happened with Oscar to some extent, there's always the risk of backsliding, okay, of an insight that you have temporarily. You know, the illusion can start, the fogs of illusion can start to return, okay, and so it's very hard, you know. I mean, outside, particularly outside of, well, I would say probably from outside of sort of religious movements that can help you to maintain a truthful self-perception. The risk of backsliding is probably quite serious for most people. But I mean, nobody's going to be perfect, okay? But obviously, to utter a platitude, but there's a real opportunity for him, I think, of a substantial, a really substantial, and, you know, shift and improvement. And we'll all fall prey to illusions again in all sorts of ways. And religion itself can often enough be illusory, no question of that. One can only utter the platitude, be on your guard. Surround yourself with those influences, those peoples and those books, and which will nourish that sense of truthfulness in your life. And in that respect, one of the things which, you know, one of the things points I try to make in the piece is that what nourishes is kindness. That it's criticism, even severe criticism, is a very different thing when it's made in a spirit of kindness and goodwill than when it's made in a spirit of malice. And even small acts of kindness can have a most tremendous effect. I mean, I quote in the piece that when Wilde describing when he was first arrested and he had to do a walk of shame through a prison yard or something or other, and he was deeply humiliated and degraded, but his friend, his very close friend Robbie Ross, was present, somehow was in the prison, and he it's not a practice we have anymore because we don't wear hats these days, but gentlemen did in those eras, and it was the thing to, as a mark of respect, to raise your hat, and he raised his hat as Wilde passed, and Wilde said that it speaks very movingly of how much that meant to him and how it encouraged him. And I've got another, if you have the time, I've got another and even more striking example of that, of what even in the midst of harrowing suffering and darkness, which, you know, again, I quote Schofield talking about, well, be frank about it, talking about his suicidal feelings that he was going through recently. I do hope he's got past those. But this is something by, just if I could just quote this from Ruth Kluger, who is a Holocaust survivor. She was in the camps as a child, just a 13-year-old girl, and she survived in part because when she first arrived at the camps, and as you know, you will know, and listeners will know, when you arrived at the camp, there were what they called these selections, where there would be a capo, a camp, thug, who was there to decide who would go straight to the gas chambers and who was capable of work, or could do something to around the camp that needed doing, and so forth, and it looked like Ruth was going to be sent straight to the ovens, but a girl who was a bit older than her, but not much older, a few years older, intervened and gave her advice on what to. So just actually spoke as the capo, the guard, was talking to Ruth. This other woman, young woman, intervened on her behalf and argued, look how strong she is. She can work. She's intelligent, and she convinced the guard to not send Ruth to the gas chambers, and that was how Ruth survived her time in the camps. And she writes, if I can just quote, I'll try to slightly longer, but not too. If I could just quote it, it's so describing this event, she says, "What happened next is loosely." Oh, sorry, I'll begin to. It was an act of the kind that is always unique, no matter how often it occurs, an incomprehensible act of grace, or put more modestly, a good deed. Yet the first term, an act of grace, is perhaps closer to the truth, although the agent was human and the term is religious. For it came out of the blue sky and was as undeserved as if its originator had been up in the clouds. I was saved by a young woman who was in as helpless a situation as the rest of us, and who nonetheless wanted nothing other than to help me. The more I think about the following scene, the more that she's about to describe what I've just described, the more astonished I am about its existence, about someone making a free decision to save another person in a place which promoted the instinct of self-preservation to the point of crime and beyond. It was both unrivaled and exemplary. Neither psychology nor biology explains it. Only free will does. Simone Weil was suspicious of practically all literature, because literature tends to make good actions boring and evil ones interesting, thus reversing the truth, she argued. In any case, Weil was right, as I learned that day in Birkenau. The good is incomparable and inexplicable as well, because it doesn't have a proper cause outside itself, and because it doesn't reach for anything beyond itself. And then a little bit later, if a prisoner passed on the beatings he received to those even more helpless than he was merely reacting as psychology and biology would expect him to. But if he did the reverse, as this woman had done for Ruth, and so one might argue that in the perverse environment of Auschwitz, absolute goodness was a possibility, like a leap of faith, beyond the humdrum chain of cause and effect. I don't know how often it was consummated. Surely not often. Surely not only in my case, but it existed. I am a witness. And what struck me about that was that, obviously Ruth was grateful for what this woman did, just from the fact that she's survived as a result of it. But what you have expressed there seems to me to be much more than kind of animal relief for survival. There's a sense of there's an old Quranic saying, if anyone saves a life, it shall be as though he had saved the lives of all mankind. It's almost as if for Ruth, the whole world has been, in the midst of the most unimaginable horror, the whole world has been redeemed by this one act. And it seems to me very much like that. Something like that is what happened for Oscar when Robbie Ross raised his hat. That's what kindness can mean, a little bit of human feeling. What's the philosopher Stanley Cavell calls acknowledging another human being. There's just another human being, our equal. When you realize that that's something which to be grateful for, and something which also you owe to others when they are suffering, when you realize that you can't cast the first stone, that's when your real turning around. I mean, if you go back at last to your question about what does Philip Schofield, what can he do about how do you change that, I think, okay, is how you do it. So um
So I wonder if the book that you quoted from, the Ruth Kluger book, is the name of it still alive? A Holocaust for Girlhood Remembered?
that's it, you're familiar with it? Yeah.
Yes, I've heard it reviewed it somewhere. So I've actually
Oh,
met someone who reviewed the book long ago on this podcast. But
okay, there you go. Good.
so final question, and returning to the parable in the Gospel of John regarding uh the first stone. Um, it is one of the details that I find overlooked in the commentaries about that line, secular and religious alike, is that the woman who was the subject of the stoning, she could be credibly charged with adultery, and at that time, you can argue whether the law itself is just or unjust, but she violated the law then. And Christ himself never denied it. So there's always this competing impulses that we all have, and this goes to, of course, the parable of the first stone is obviously a great polemic against cancel culture, and we all have to guard ourselves against it because we all participate in it in some way, shape, or form, even though we say that we are anti-cancel culture. And there's the two competing impulses that I've observed are the desire to reach a moral purity, in that we want to be better people, we want to be moral citizens, but at the same time, we want to be kind to those who may not be as morally pure as we think they should be, because we are not as morally pure as we think we are. So I guess to wrap up every case, every individuals we've mentioned, how how do you reconcile these competing impulses?
Oh wow. How do I reconcile these competing impulses? Well, first, just one comment about oh, I was going to comment on something that you said about purity, um, and cancel culture and so forth. I mean, I think one of the great traps is to seek a sort of faux purity, faux moral purity. I mean, I think wokeness is a good example of a kind of faux moral purity. Okay, I'm on the right side of history. I've got the right ideas and the right opinions. Okay, and I can be a ruthless so and so towards all those evil people who disagree. Okay, so the world is divided into the good and the evil. Uh, Whereas, as Solzhenitsyn said, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart. So I'll just make that comment in passing what you said. But to answer your question, well, I'm not sure I can add terrific amount of what I've said before. Is that it's not that we shouldn't censure behavior which deserves to be censured. It's not we shouldn't call it out. It's not that it shouldn't have consequences. I mean, I think probably Schofield does. I mean, does deserve to have lost his job. Arguably at least. Whether he deserves to be permanently banished from television or not, I don't know. But it's not, forgiveness and reconciliation does not mean that you're exempt from consequences or from criticism. Far from it. But we've got to distinguish between criticism, between holding to account, between holding people responsible and holding ourselves responsible, and simply pouring our scorn onto people, acting. I mean, there's some sense in which, I mean, one thing that's true there are a lot of problems with Kant's moral philosophy, but one element of truth in Kant's philosophy, which was also also is remarked upon by Simone Weil, who I mentioned a moment ago, is that there is something impersonal about morality. There is something right in the idea that we're judging ourselves by standards which apply to all of us. And I'm not just, and I can't just, make excuses for myself. So when I'm judging according to a standard to which I am as answerable as you are, then I can't just say, well, to hell with you, pour scorn and calumny and disdain and upon Chong, okay, and ride free myself, okay. If I want to have the possibility of forgiveness for myself, I've got to hold open the possibility of forgiveness for you. And so, morality is in that sense has a certain kind of impersonality to it. It's not just pleading your own case, okay, or making a special case for yourself. And that seems to me to be true. So the thing to grasp is that, yes, we must judge people according to, the right standards and values to which we should all aspire and be held accountable, but not to turn that judgment into a kind of means of simply venting our spleen and our own hurt and pain, which is what I think we do ultimately. Where does this come from, all this nastiness? I don't think it comes from anywhere good inside us. The Schadenfreude, the cruelty of it comes from somewhere dark. And it's coming from something deeply personal in each of us. And we've got to deal with that inside ourselves and stop inflicting it on other people. So I think if we keep clear the distinction between appropriate moral judgment and appraisal and acceptance, and continuing to respect the person as a person and not degrading them as a person, and holding open to them the possibility of forgiveness and reconciliation, then we can find a way to both have appropriate judgment without releasing carnage into the world.
Well, and on that,
if that makes sense. Okay.
On that wonderful note, thank you very much for joining the show, Andrew Gleeson from Australia.
Well, thank you, Chong. Thank you very much.
Take very good care of yourself.
Okay.